Hello and welcome to today's episode of Tool Time with Professor Levy. Today we are going to be investigating making a new jig for my router here. I have the router assembled from its base plate. Over here to the right of me I have a piece of plywood. We're going to now take a few measurements and then rip the plywood down. What I need to know is the width of this faceplate here. This faceplate is 5 3/4 of an inch diameter. So I am going to rip the piece of plywood here to my right down to 6 inches, which will be a good measurement for the router faceplate to sit inside. So that is what we're going to do now. Now we're over here at the table saw. I'm going to set the fence of the table saw to 6 inches. I'm going to take my piece of plywood here and make sure that our blade height is sufficient for it to cut. And we're good. So I'm now going to turn dust collection on and pass the piece of plywood through the saw. Now I'm opening the gate so it collects the dust from the table saw. Find some safety glasses. I'm going to turn the saw on and let it come to speed. And now we're going to pass this plywood through the saw. We're going to make sure that the plywood goes all the way past the blade first. Staying nice and steady along the fence. And all the way through. And we'll turn dust collection off. And now we have our 6-inch board. Now I want to talk about the router and the router bits and some router terminology and why we're making this jig. So this is our router. It's made by a company named Metabo now. It used to be Hitachi. Routers come with a few different faceplates. This one allows us to guide it with these 2 handles. There are other router faceplates that you can get that are plunge plates, so it actually holds with springs the router up from your material, so you can position the router where you want it to be and then plunge down into your cut. This isn't one of those faceplates, but for us it will work perfectly for cutting circles with this radius jig that we're making. We'll just have to start the saw off of the piece that we are trying to cut the radius into, or slowly lower it down. The faceplate connects to the router down these spirals by twisting on, and then with this lever here locks into position. I'm gonna take this off again. The router bit that we're using today and for cutting the radii that we're going to cut is a 3/4 inch plunge bit. This will cut a straight column into whatever we're inserting it into. If we decide that we want to use a different width bit for cutting with this router jig, we will have to change the center point that the jig turns on to match where the cutting edge of the router bit is in relation to the jig. What we're going to do now is measure from the edge the distance from the edge to the cutting surface of the router bit is 2 7/16 of an inch. So that is going to be the mark that we establish as our center line, is going to be 2 7/16 of an inch in from the faceplate. The faceplate, because we ripped our plywood to 6 inches, and the faceplate being, I believe it was 5 3/4, is going to change that measurement, but we will get into that in a minute. The faceplate of our router comes with this plastic cover on it. We are at this point going to remove the cover. There are 3 screws. One of them I have already removed that we're going to take off now. That's 2 and 3. What this is going to allow for us to do is, once we position this on our piece of plywood, we will be able to index where these 3 holes that originally came through here are, and then we can drill those holes so we can bolt the router to our piece of plywood. What I'm going to do now is take my combination square, and we are going to inset this, which is 3/4 of an inch shorter than the board that we're going to screw it to. We're going to place it perfectly centered in this board. Because this is 5 3/4 of an inch, and the board that we ripped is 6 inches, we are going to put a mark 1/8 of an inch inset from either side, and then using our combination square, we're going to draw a line that is that 1/8 of an inch either side. And if we have done our math properly, this router faceplate should sit perfectly between those 2 lines. And it does. I would like it to sit flush with the edge of the plywood here, because it will allow me to cut the largest radius that I can possibly cut. And now I'm just going to mark with a very sharp pencil where those 3 bolt holes want to be. You can now see on the piece of plywood where I have scribed 3 holes. Those holes are where I'm going to drill with the drill bit for the faceplate of the router to receive 3 bolts. I am now in my drill index here, trying to find a drill bit that is most nearest to the size of the bolt, and that is this one. What we're going to do now is change the battery from our impact driver. Okay, so we have switched the battery from our impact driver into our screw gun. We're going to undo the chuck and take the driver out. We're going to replace it with the drill bit we just selected. Okay, we have that secured. So now we're going to drill these 3 holes. We're going to try to be centered in the holes we drew. I'm giving it just a couple of turns to start with so the bit doesn't drift, and now we can go all the way through. We're going to repeat this process with the other 2 holes. And as I just demonstrated there, when the drill bit goes through the wood, it gets hot. That was a little painful. Clear off the dust. So now we should be able to bolt our faceplate onto it. Just like so. Now I'm going to loosely put a nut onto that. And then the reason I'm putting these nuts on loosely for now is so that I can position the faceplate of the router so it picks up all 3 of those holes, and then we can come back and tighten it. So that's 2. If I can get the nut to attach. There we go. That's 2 attached. And then our 3rd and final. This is the one that will be the hardest to make. And we're on. So I'm going to actually, since I know that we're aligned, I'm going to tighten the other ones down. To tighten these nuts, I'm going to use the combination open-ended box wrench. Then we'll tighten the other one down. Now we're going to tighten our last bolt here. The 3rd one's always the hard one. Try using on the back side here is a Phillips head. There we go. So this is working much better than the problem that we have that I'm running into here is that our box wrench isn't quite the right size for these machine screws and therefore is slipping a little bit. And tighten the 3rd screw. Okay, so our faceplate is now firmly attached to our router. There are 2 steps that remain in order for us to complete the assembly of this jig. Step 1 would be to insert the router into the faceplate and plunge the hole through the faceplate through the plywood. And the second will then be to take that measurement and determine where our pivot point on our plywood is. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is reinsert the router into the faceplate, like so. And then I'm going to lock it so it can't go down any further. The other thing I'm going to do is go grab 2 screws, and I am going to screw this router jig to the table so that it can't walk on me while I route this hole into it. Okay, so now as I route the hole into the router jig, it will not be able to move the jig on the table. I'm now going to, I just made sure the power to the router is off. I'm going to connect the power to the router, put my safety glasses on. Now I'm going to turn the router on and slowly lower it into the plywood. Now we're entering into the plywood. Backing off a little bit. And again. And we're all the way through. Allow the router to stop. And we are through the router. So now we can lock the router down. So now we've created a jig that will allow us to cut circles with this router. I'm going to unscrew it, then flip it over. We're going to see if we can extend the router bit some so that it is able to go through thicker material, and we will go from there. So now that we have our faceplate connected to the plywood and our plunge cut bit sunk through the plywood, it's now time to draw the center line of the jig, which will be the pivot point for any of the radii we come up with. The board's 6 inches wide, so our pivot point is going to be the center, 3 inches. So I'm going to take the combination square. I've already set it to 3 inches, and we're going to draw a line all the way from the router base carefully all the way down the other end of the router jig, like so. Now we have our pivot point. So I'm going to demonstrate using this jig to cut an arc into a piece of plywood. I need to buy a router bit that is longer than the one I currently have to be able to cut all the way through 3/4 inch material, but you'll at least be able to see me take several passes on a piece and cut an arc into the piece of plywood. Okay, I have found a piece of 1/4 inch plywood in our scrap rack, so I'm going to be able to actually show you cutting all the way through this. So what I'm going to determine now, I'm going to screw this to the table so it doesn't move on me. Okay, so I have taken a sheet of 1/4 inch plywood here because we will be able to cut all the way through this. I've screwed it securely down to the table so that when I cut through it, it doesn't move. I'm now going to grab the router and the extension cord, set it in here. We're going to plunge cut this probably in 2 passes, and you will see a perfect curve. Just grabbing the extension cord. One of the things that we're going to want to be careful about when we're doing this is not to cut through the extension cord with the router. Okay, so I now have the router. And I'm going to lock it in place. The reason I lock the router in place, even though it's not as low as I want it to be yet, is because I don't want to accidentally turn it on and have it sink. I'm now going to tie a loose knot in the extension cord here. And we're going to drape the extension cord so that it isn't in our way. I'm now just going to confirm that the screws that I have placed here aren't going to be in the way of the router bit, because that would A, damage the router bit and cause sparks and be a little bit dangerous. And grab the router. I just noticed we need to put one more screw to hold the offcut so it doesn't spin into the blade. Put that one right there. So now we should be set up to cut this. Okie dokie. So we are going to start right here. We're going to turn the router on, let it come to speed. We're not tall enough to pass through it yet. Now we're going to make a pass. Still not low enough. Make another pass. Now we're cutting into the wood. So our router jig isn't, or our router bit isn't deep enough to go through even 1/4-inch plywood, but I will take you over and show you the 1/4-inch plywood. So this is the arc that I just used the router to cut with the router jig into this 1/4 ply. If I had a deeper bit, I would be able to plunge cut all the way through even 3/4-inch material. It just means that we need to buy a deeper bit, which we will do. This is going to be a more secure and clean way. The reason I like the router jig better for cutting arcs is because it actually cuts a cleaner arc than the jigsaw. The problem with the jigsaw is that the blade has the tendency to move a little bit from side to side, and once you have moved to one side, it will track that way through the entire cut. So This jig is just a cleaner way of cutting perfect arcs every time. Thank you for watching this episode of Tool Time with Professor Levy. I hope you learned and enjoyed something from this video. Next time we will possibly look at exploring an elliptical router jig. So that is a router jig that is going to be able to cut an oval or an elliptical arc or circle.